Welcome to another series from me, Ginger GM Simon Williams. I'm a grandmaster and I use various checkmate patterns throughout my career. And in this series, which is going to contain at least 15 videos, maybe more, I'm going to show you a number of patterns that you can use in your own games. We're going to start off with the fairly simple ones, and then we're going to go to more abstract ones that you may have not seen. This first video is concentrating on Fool's Mate, which is the quickest checkmate possible. So called because only a fool will fall into it. And there is some alliteration from me. That's why I'm a grandmaster. So what is Fool's Mate? Well, let's show you the very basics of it first. Fool's Mate is where white plays something along the lines of f3. And now after a move like e5, opening up the bishop and the queen, the horrendous move g4. And this is such a bad move because black can now take advantage of this weakened diagonal, the h4 e1 diagonal, by playing queen to h4, checkmate. Not a good way to finish the game from white. Now, Fool's Mate is really something you shouldn't see too often. It's a checkmate where one side has to be very cooperative because in this example, white has to play bad moves in order to lose. Black doesn't do anything special. So really Fool's Mate is something which occurs when one player plays very badly at the start of the game. And Fool's Mate is really the most important characteristics of this is the weakening of this diagonal if white is the fool, or some cases the weakening of this diagonal, the h5 e8 diagonal, if black is the fool. So let's have a look at a couple more examples of this. Okay, well, in another game, white started with d4 and he lost only a couple of moves later. You might be thinking, how? Well, knight to f6 was played by black and now knight to d2. Already a rather surprising and inferior move. This blocks in the bishop and also the pawn on d4 now has no protection from the queen. So the knight is not on a good square. Black aims to take advantage of this by playing e5, a kind of gambit line to gain a bit of time and to try to trap white. It works perfectly. White grabs that pawn. Now black places his knight upon g4, aiming to win back the pawn, but also with some other ideas in mind. White gives the knight a kick, thinking, okay, I'll give my pawn back, but I'll be safe. But he misses a really important move now. Can you see the move? Knight to e3, a devastating move. And in this position, white resigned only on move 4. Oh, my words, imagine that happening. Because he's going to lose his queen, and that's quite serious. Or if he captures the knight, again, he has weakened this diagonal. Remember, for Fool's Mate, this diagonal, when it's happening to white, is the key diagonal. And after queen to h4 check, it's worth noting the white pawn is on h3, so you can't really go g3 before that pawn was defended, because queen takes g3 is checkmate. Again, another example is Fool's Mate. Now, in order for this to work, really one side has to play a loosening move like f4, f5, or move their g-pawn and move their g-pawn. So another example of this, which has occurred actually in far too many games, is when white goes f4. So already white is asking for this diagonal to come under attack. This is not a serious problem if white knows what he's doing. But here, a very dangerous reply to this is the From's gambit, e5. It's slightly in the same spirit as the last gambit we saw. Black gives up a pawn to gain quick development. And here there are two ways white can fall into Fool's gambit. Number one is if he tries to guard his pawn with the very bad move g3. The point being, after pawn takes f4, white should now not take the pawn because he's weakened his diagonal, and queen to h4 is yet another example of Fool's Mate. One of my favourite Fool's Mate that I show juniors I'm teaching is if white captures on e5 and now black plays d6, trying to accelerate his development after pawn takes d6, bishop takes d6, and also creating a deadly threat. Can you see the threat here? Well, it's often happened where white hasn't seen the threat and has played a move like knight to c3, really not paying attention to his weakened diagonal. Now queen to h4 check, and it's going to be checkmate very quickly. White has to play g3, but in this example, black has 2 pieces attacking that pawn. So black can play even queen takes g3. And I have to say, I love sacrificing my queen. So I'd rather take there with my queen than my bishop, because my opponent might get excited. And I love showing kids this because the kids go, I can win your queen. Yay! But after bishop takes g3, you might win my queen, but you lose the game. Thank you very much. And we've only looked at this so far from the example of white being the fool. So now let's have a look at one last example of black now being the fool. And after the starting move pawn to d4, f5 is a move I often play, the so-called Dutch defense. And one line which is very tricky is now bishop to g5, where black can try to chase this bishop away with h6. The bishop moves, and now g5. And now let's say the bishop moves again. Black has to be very careful here because he's moved his f-pawn and his g-pawn, weakening the diagonal towards his king. So if he continues with f4, a much better move, by the way, would have been knight to f6 because that covers more squares, develops a piece. White can now play e3. And already queen to h5 is a threat. One very attractive game that occurred in this position between Teed and Delmar in 1896 occurred h5, trying to stop the queen coming in. And now a very surprising move, bishop to d3, because again, you're leaving your bishop on pre here. Rook to h6, defending that square, but white has a forced checkmate here. Can you work it out? The rook is the only defender of that square, so you need to distract the rook. Queen takes h5. Don't you just love the way I'm finding ways to sacrifice my queen with fool's mate already? Rook takes h5, and now because the rook no longer defends g6, bishop to g6 checkmate. So fool's mate is really our first introduction to this series of checkmate patterns. Now don't fear if you're a high rated player. I have to start from the bottom and move through all the ones. But in the next couple of examples, they're already going to get much tougher. And I'm going to try to give simple cases and much more complex cases for each checkmate pattern. Like I said, I really didn't realize how many names, how many different checkmates there were out there. And this course and this series has really helped me just confirming those patterns. And that's my aim in this, to try to get you to think about these patterns, try to subconsciously remember them when you're playing your own games. So thank you for watching this video. I recommend you watch the other videos in this series. Bye for now. This video concentrates on the back rank checkmate, something that can be very simple or very complex. Our first example here actually is from a world champions game, Capablanca with the black pieces. This was played in an exhibition match. White now played knight to b5. And we're going to see a sequence here which demonstrates how one side's back rank can be very weak and how you can take advantage of it. You can see that both kings here have 3 pawns in front of them. So the kings are kind of lacking any oxygen. They can't escape. So if a rook or a queen was able to come down to the back rank, this is the back rank here, the king would be trapped. And this is precisely what Capablanca does. He now, after knight to b5, moves his rook, rook to c5. And I'm sure he must have seen the sequence in advance. White now thinks, happy days, I can win a pawn on c3. And he plays knight takes c3. But the world champion Capablanca had seen a little bit further. Knight takes c3. And you can see here, the more pieces that get exchanged, the weaker white's back rank becomes. Rook takes c3. And now after rook takes c3, white plays rook takes c3. And the danger bells should be ringing because there is no protection for white on the back rank. But the next move is certainly a very special move here, because it may look like black comes all the way down with queen to b1 check here. But this is actually easily defended. White can go queen to f1. And now if the queens get exchanged, white is a pawn up in the ending. And if black plays the horrendously bad move, rook to d1, black has now left his back rank open. So the rook comes to c8 with checkmate. So what is the move that black needs to play here? Well, again, this series of videos is all about recognizing patterns. If you recognize your opponent's king is trapped in, it's lacking oxygen, you should be looking at ways to divert your opponent's pieces away from the defense of the back rank to try to get your own pieces into the back rank. And you should be calculating at a much more in-depth level than you would do if these danger signs were not ringing in your ears. In this position, black can play the amazing move queen to b2. This diverts the queen away from f1, and white is completely lost here. For example, if white goes queen takes b2, rook to d1 is already checkmate. There's no longer a defensive move like queen to f1. What else can white play here? Well, not too much. If, for example, white plays queen to e1, trying to defend the back rank, black can now again try to divert that queen away from defense by playing queen takes c3 and then rook to d1 checkmate coming up next move. So this is a very simple, I say simple, it's actually a little bit complex, but this is taken from a real game, a world championship game. And we're now going to look at another example, which is quite a lot more complex. And, you know, those of you of a high level here might even struggle with this next example. So let's move there now. So this more complex example is taken from a very renowned chess player, Tartakova. And we dive into a seemingly harmless position where white now has to take the piece back on g5, otherwise it's going to be a piece down. Rook takes g5. But again, what are the important factors, the important patterns that should be raising alarm signals in your mind? Well, the rook on g5 is a long way out of play. It should be protecting that back rank. It's not really doing anything on g5. It's really misplaced there. So black also has the open f file for his rook, and the queen may be able to find a way in. Can you think of what black should be trying to do here? It's very pretty what black now plays. Really, the one thing you've got to remember is the f1 square is key. If you can try to force the king to h1 and get the queen away from the back rank, the rook can come in there. And you can do this through a series of force moves. And force moves are always the things you should be looking for in chess, mainly. Always start with the force moves. Now, in this position, Tartakova played queen b6 check. He could have gone queen c5 straight away, but this is more picturesque. There's only one move white can play, king to h1. Now, again, look for force moves here. Is there any way black can create a threat? Now, there are a couple of moves that are maybe a little bit superficial. I mean, maybe a move such as queen to b4 gets your attention because you'll try and divert the queen away. So if queen takes b4, you have rook to f1 checkmate. But when you're looking at patterns, when you're calculating, you always must consider your opponent's best defense. And in this position, white can get his rook back in the game with a move such as rook takes e5, and white may even be winning here, having a two-pawn advantage. So it's more important in this position to not allow that rook in the game, but create another threat which leaves white's rook struggling there. So now queen to b5, threatening either rook to f1 or queen to f1, with checkmate or the win of the queen coming up. And look how the queen sneaks its way into the position. It's very, very nice. King to g1, the only way to defend this square. Queen to c5 check, sneaking in. Of course, we know he could have played this earlier, but I like the way he does this. King to h1. How can you make progress? You want to get the black queen into the most active square. Queen to c4. It's slowly coming into white's half. Again, the threat is rook to f1. King to g1 is the only move. Queen to d4 check. King to h1. And black has now moved the queen from a rather passive d6 square into a much more active square on d4. Look at that square. Very powerful square. Now, again, there are a number of options here. Try to think what you would play, because you could be tempted to play queen d3. Is that the right move? Remember that the key factors in this pattern that you should be looking for is the white queen is on the best square it can be on. At the moment, it's defending. If you can maneuver that queen elsewhere, then you may well win very easily. So pause the video if you need to. Well, here, queen to e4 is the best move. you're really placing the queen under so much trouble. Again, if queen takes e4, rook to f1 is mate. The queen is struggling for squares. And after the game continuation, queen to c1, you can work out other continuations yourself at home. Black can now go queen to d3. And the point is here, the white queen's on a lot worse square. King to g1, the only way to stop f1. And again, this is not so easy, but there is a way to do this. Queen to d4 check, king to h1, and now the key move, which certainly has big similarities to the last game of Capablanca's. It's to do with the queen and the rook. Hopefully, after seeing Capablanca's game, you can spot this one, this move. Again, pause the video if you need to. What is the best way to win this position? Queen to d2. If you went for queen takes b2 here, that is okay. But queen to d2, trying to divert the queen away from the back rank, also tries to pick up the rook on g5. And of course, now white has no defense. If the queen moves, we take the rook. If we take the black queen, we have bang, checkmate on the back rank. So there's some examples of the back rank checkmate, and this comes up a lot in chess. So I'm sure you're well aware of this, but I particularly like that last example, which really is a beautiful demonstration of misplaced pieces as well. And like I said, they're going to get a lot harder, these checkmate patterns. Let's move on to the other one. We now move on to a checkmate which I coined the kiss of death. I heard this when I was taught in Richmond, and the whole point of this checkmate is you use your queen to deliver a deadly checkmate to your opponent's king. In this case, queen to e7, you can see that the queen is giving the opponent's king that deadly kiss, hence the kiss of death checkmate. Now, this is a very basic example of this pattern, and there are a number of different ways this can occur. For example, here, the king is defending the queen, which of course is key. The black king cannot take the queen, can't move into the king's range. But you could have a number of other pieces defending the queen. You could have a pawn, for example. You could have a knight, a bishop, a rook. But the kiss of death checkmate is really where the queen comes right in front of the opposing king, delivering checkmate. Now we're going to take a look at some much more complex examples of this checkmate. And again, we're going to look out for things that you should be noting when you are playing your own games. How can you actually get these checkmates to work? What should you be looking for? Let's move on to another example now to jump into, actually, I'm afraid, my brain. I'm now taking the black pieces, playing against a very strong ex-Russian grandmaster, over 2600. This game got the best game prize in the Isle of Man competition about 10 years ago. You can see my pieces converging around my opponent's king. And already my pattern recognition is going spider sense. My queen is very near my opponent's king. I'm threatening rook takes h3 here with mate to follow. My opponent plays rook d1. In order to deliver checkmate, you need to throw your pieces into the attack. I don't have anything immediate here, so I move my knight around. Knight to f6. My opponent aims to swap the queens off with queen to e1, but now a devastating technique, a devastating tactical sequence. Now, why does this work, and how does this relate to the kiss of death? Well, the key thing about this combination we're going to see here is that it works because of the threat of the kiss of death checkmate. So when you're trying to spot these kind of patterns in your own games and you're trying to improve your sense of when to attack, you should really be looking at certain signs. For example, here I have a queen, rook, knight, and bishop all potentially attacking my opponent's king, which means there's very likely to be a breakthrough, especially as my opponent doesn't have any pieces near his king. Look at his pieces, they're all over on the other side of the board. So I should be looking for a blast. I should be looking for a breakthrough. Like I mentioned before, you've got to look for the most forcing moves, ways to open up your opponent's king. That is normally checks. So all I did here, I was looking for checks and captures that forced a sequence of moves. And I was also looking at threats. So the first move I looked at, and I didn't need to look at any other moves, I certainly don't want to exchange queens because then I won't be able to checkmate my opponent, was rook takes h3. And this works a treat. Pawn takes h3, queen takes h3 check, king to g1. And can you now see my idea, which combines this very important concept of the kiss of death? And this will improve in all your games. As you become a better chess player, you will recognize certain things which will lead to these checkmate patterns. Here, the key thing is actually the bishop and my queen having the potential to come into g2. So what is the move here? And if there's not a check that does anything good, and if there's not a capture which really creates a good threat, you should be looking at threats. Pause if you need to. Knight to g4. Hey ho, here we come. Over the top, boys. And the point of this is that if white tries to take that knight, we see how the kiss of death is a very important concept. My queen would just come into g2 with checkmate. And after knight g4, my opponent is in a very bad situation because I'm threatening queen to h2 and queen to f1 checkmate, which is extremely hard to stop, nearly impossible. And my opponent went on to lose this position. My attack was too strong. Now, I want to show you one more example of the kiss of death, a very beautiful example, which shows great vision from one of England's best players. So let's move over to that quickly now. So the player of the white pieces I mentioned is Nigel Short, and this is maybe his immortal chess game. This is really a chess game that every chess player needs to know. Now, we're just going to look at a position after move 30 where black plays h5. Now, again, you may be thinking, how on earth is the kiss of death relevant to this position? Well, we're going to see it is. And when you start to recognize these patterns, you start to try to think of how you can create these patterns. You can work backwards and try to think of a sequence of events that leads to the pattern. So as we know, the kiss of death is where the queen comes in front of the opponent's king. But how on earth is the white queen going to get to g7 here without being taken? Well, it's an amazing, amazing idea here. And another reason this works is because black is so tied down. Black doesn't have any active possibilities. Nigel now played king to h2. You may be thinking, why on earth is this scary? That's nothing. What is that move? We'll take a look. Rook to c8, and now king to g3. Can you see Nigel's idea yet? The rook goes back to e8 because Tinman can't move anything. King to f4. And here, again, black is pretty helpless. He plays bishop to c8, attacking the rook. Even Nigel's play is confusing me here. What would you play now? Would you move your rook, which was attacked, or do you have another idea? Remember the kiss of death checkmate. This is the pattern you're going for here, and you can force the win here. Pause if you need to. King to g5, and this is the absolutely beautiful idea behind this play. And the point of this is, after bishop takes d7, I must point out here that Tinman actually resigned here. He hasn't got a defense such as king h7 because Nigel now has queen takes g6 check. Quite surprisingly, the pawn on f7 is pinned. And the whole point is, after bishop takes d7, the king finishes its triumphant march with king to h6, and there's no way black can stop the kiss of death checkmate with queen to g7. And again, this video is really trying to demonstrate various examples from real play, real examples from games when this checkmate has been the deciding factor. So you need to have these ideas in mind. If your queen is dangerously placed around your opponent's king, look at ways you can try to create this kiss of death checkmate. And I especially like this last example, but of course, I enjoy my checkmate more. Okay, loads more of these puzzles to come. Please stay tuned for my other videos. We now move on to one of the oldest checkmate patterns that was ever published, the Damiano checkmate. And apparently this first was published in 1512. So maybe some people at chess.com can still remember this puzzle. But it was actually failed to be shown on any databases because in the original publication, Damiano, who came up with this checkmate, did not place the white king on the board, which is a schoolboy error. Now, what is this checkmate? Well, have a look at the following position here. Can you see a way for white to force checkmate? Well, he can do this by first giving up his rook to h8 check. And the key things to remember about this checkmate is if you have an open Harry file, H file, if you have a pawn or bishop on g6, and your opponent's king is on g8, this pattern can often occur. And what you're really trying to do is just get your queen from d1 or wherever it is on the board to h7. This is the key idea of the Damiano checkmate, to get your queen right into h7. So it's the neighbor of the kiss of death. And the reason it's called Damiano checkmate is because you do often give up your rook first. Now, here, whites can also win by playing queen to h5. But my first thought in any tactical sequence is you should always look at the checks first. And this is a good lesson here. I mean, there's only two checks. Queen d5 check would lose your queen. The only other check is rook to h8 check. And black has one move. And now that the rook has got out the way, the queen has access into the position. It can either go to h5 or to h1. For example, queen h1 check, and it's going to be checkmate very shortly on h7. So that is the basic Damiano puzzle. But there are a number of cases when this has occurred in games. I'm now going to show you an actual loss which I had when my opponent did the Damiano on me. And again, in order for him to play this brilliant tactic we're going to see, he must have been aware of this pattern. And that's one of the aims of this series. Once you're aware of the patterns, you'll spot the tactics more easily. So let's move on to this example now. So like I mentioned, this is a game I played. I had the black pieces here, and I was now playing, should I say now? I was playing who is now a very famous publisher of books, Jacob Agard, originally from Denmark, a grandmaster. He had white. Agard had just taken on e4. I took back with my f-pawn. And you may be thinking here, how on earth is this related to the Damiano technique? Well, what was the Damiano technique? Remember what I said? It's basically an open h-file and a pawn or a bishop on g6. And by looking at this position and looking at the most forcing moves and being able to realize the pattern that I've just shown you, you may be able to see a very dangerous sequence that white now played. And I have to say, it took me by a nasty surprise. Knight to g6 check, a fantastic move. Now, I really have to take that knight, otherwise I'm going to lose my bishop. And the point of this is, after pawn takes g6, white is now setting up the typical Damiano technique. A pawn on g6, a rook on h1, and all he needs to try to do now, can you remember his next idea, is to get the queen into h7. I only have one move, king to g8. What should white do now? And this is quite an advanced example because it's not entirely straightforward. But if you remember the technique about getting the queen around, it should become clear. Queen to c1. Probably the same occurs with the queen going to d1 or to b1. The queen needs to have access to h1. Now, if white had tried something like rook to h5, with the idea of going rook to h1, this would have given me time to defend. And you always have to consider your opponent's best defense. And after rook to f6, I have time to take on g6 and run with my king to f7. Now, after queen to c1, this very excellent move, I can no longer play rook to f6 because of the Damiano attack. And can you remember how this attack occurs? White can force checkmate here in typical fashion. Rook to h8 check. The king has to take that. And now this queen comes in to that h7 square. Queen h1 check. Queen h7 check. And in this position, the black king is still blocked in. So queen to h8 delivers this checkmate. After queen to c1, I'm in a pretty helpless situation. I tried queen to d8 with the idea of blocking the h-file with bishop to h4. My opponent played an interesting move here with bishop to c7, but he actually had a much stronger move than this. And it was a much more thematic move. Maybe you can improve on my grandmaster opponent's play here. What can white do now in order to force my resignation? There's nothing much I can do after a very forcing sequence. Again, pause if you need to. Well, bishop to c7 was okay, but there's no reason to stop the Damiano technique here. Rook to h8 actually works anyway. The point being, king takes, queen to h1 check. Now my king cannot move because the queen flies into h7. I have to play bishop to h4, and it looks like black might be okay here because the queen is defending the bishop. But after the move g5, well, it's clear to see that black is losing. There's not really any sufficient way to stop the white queen coming into h4, into h7, delivering mate. And desperate tries like queen takes g5 will leave black with a serious material deficiency. So this would have been the simplest way to win. And again, this whole technique is about getting the queen into your opponent's position. Now, one more example coming up of this pattern, a slightly different version of it from a very recent match. So let's move over there now. The last example I want to use in the Damiano pattern, just to demonstrate these patterns are not fantasy. They don't just happen on very rare occasions. They actually will happen quite regularly. And if you know all of these patterns, they're probably going to occur in most of your games at some point. That's the key thing. The better you know them, the better prepared you'll be. And this game, at the time of me filming, is actually taken from yesterday. On the white side, we have Aronium. On the side of the black pieces, Nepananachi. And it's taken from the chess.com speed challenge, which I was very enjoying watching, a great competition on chess.com. And here, a slightly different technique, but I think it's the same idea. In this position, Aronian, now with the white pieces in a very complex position, played knight to e7 check. And amazing that these guys can see such tactics so quickly. It really mind combobulates me. I love that word. I had to get it in. Combobulation. Love combobulation. And the point of this tactic is to release the bishop. And after knight takes e7, Aronian now played bishop takes e6 check. Now, actually, black resigned here. If he plays rook to f7, white is going to win too much material. He'll be a rook up. He'll win the game. And the whole point of black's resignation is that if he goes king to h8, can you see this slightly different version of the checkmate we're researching here? Remember, it's about the queen coming into h7 normally, but this has the same technique, the same pattern. And what I'm showing you here is that when you know the basic checkmates, you'll be able to slightly change them. Hopefully, you'll be able to notice these aspects, the key aspects of them, and hopefully you'll be able to use them in your own games. Well, that's the idea anyway. Doesn't always work for me, but hey-ho, it worked for Aronian here. The point of this is we need to open up the h-file. We need to get our queen to h1. So rook takes h7, check. And after king takes h7, we can now move our queen to h7, check. There's only one defense. Bishop to h6, and after bishop to h6, well, the queen flies in to h6 with checkmate. So again, a similar theme, I think, to the earlier two videos, or should I say the earlier topics of this one video. And again, I really like this checkmate. It's getting very pretty, and we've still got 10 more to go. So I hope you stay tuned for the rest of these pattern checkmates, and I enjoyed this one a lot. So let's move on. Well, hopefully you'll move on with me to another video soon. Bye for now. Welcome to the 6th video in this mating range. And now we're going to look at the opera checkmate. Sorry, I was trying to do a bit of opera singing there. Not good for the ears. But what is the opera checkmate? Well, the opera checkmate involves the rook and the bishop. And the rook comes flying down. Here we go. Rook to d8. And it's defended by the bishop, trapping the enemy's king on the back rank. And there's always something in the way. So it can be any piece here on f7 trapping the king, except for a knight, because obviously a knight would be able to take the rook. And in this situation, the bishop is the piece that also traps the king in. So this is the basic version of the opera checkmate. And I'm now going to explain to you why it's called the opera checkmate and where it came about. So let's move on to the next game. And we have a very famous example of this checkmate in action. So there's quite an amusing story behind the name of this checkmate. Apparently it relates to this game and the position we're going to go through here, which was played in 1858 at an opera house in Paris. Morphy had the white pieces and he was playing against two opponents who took black. The first player was a German noble, the Duke of Brunswick, and also against the French, should we say, posh aristocrats. Lovely. And apparently they had a box at the opera. The opera was going on, but they were making so much noise in the box, which was right next to this opera, that people in the opera, the performers, actually took a look to see what on earth was going on in the box. It was a chess game. It's like being at a football match, putting off the players because there's too much noise, but it was a chess game. So what is this checkmate? Well, let's have a look. Morphy was white. And here he played bishop to g5. And what this game really demonstrates is the power of pieces and quick development. Look at all the white's pieces, lovely developed. And here black flicks in b5, but the queen is trapping the king on e8. The bishop on f8 is trapped. And really black has horrendous pieces throughout his position. So it's time to sacrifice. Morphy plays knight takes b5. And the point of this is, after pawn takes, he has bishop takes b5 check. And now this black king is really open. He blocks with knight bd7, and Morphy increased the pressure with a natural move, castle's queen side, bringing the rook into the attack. Black defends by bringing his rook to d8 because there was a threat of bishop takes f6 followed by a capture on d7. And now what should Morphy play, or what indeed did Morphy play? So put yourself in White's position here and pause the video if you need to. What would you do here? And remember, getting all the pieces into the attack is key, even if you have to sacrifice, because Morphy wasn't afraid to sacrifice. Well, rook takes d7, another beautiful move, because this enables the rook on h1 to come in. Rook takes d7 from black, otherwise he'd lose the queen, and now rook to d1. And in this position, it's not really any good way to stop White taking on d7. Queen to e6 was played, and Morphy now played bishop takes d7 check. Again, Black's move here is pretty much forced. Knight takes d7. And can you see in this position the beautiful tactic that Morphy used? And after his next two moves, we have the opera checkmate. So what did White do? Pause if you need to here. Queen to b8 check, removing the knight on d7 from its post. And after the only move, knight takes b8, we can see the combination of the bishop and the rook. And rook to d8 is indeed checkmate there. So a very nice example of the offered checkmate. And let's now look at one last case of this, just so we get a good feeling for really what this checkmate is all about. So we're now going to rely on our good friend Steinitz to demonstrate the opera checkmate. And this is a game he had against a chap called Vines. And Black here played knight to a6. So you can see in this position, the Black king is not in the center of the board, but we can still create a version of the opera checkmate here. So imagine you're White. How can you try to get this combination of the rooks and the bishop, creating that net around the Black king? If you need to pause the video, please do so now. Well, White needs to open up the bishop on f4 first, and there's something in the way of that bishop, the pawn. So d7 check is a very good move, opening up the bishop to the b8 square, and this is the key idea. There's only one move that Black can play, and that's rook takes d7. And now, can you see the end? Rook to b8 check. The knight has to capture that rook, and rook takes b8 check again demonstrates the opera checkmate. Slightly different to the last example because we have a rook blocking the king's escape and not a pawn this time, but it's exactly the same concept of bishop and rook. So remember, if you have a bishop striking down across the enemy's king, and if you have a rook that can come down, you should be looking for this kind of pattern in your own games. And that is the opera checkmate for you.